Those thoughts on insurance and those issues around employment law take us neatly to Henry Doswell. Henry is principal at Doswell Law Employment Solicitors in Ashford. Henry, thank you so much for joining us too. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Julia. Thank you for having me on the show.
Obviously, this is territory that I think employment lawyers will have been looking at for some time, because some employers have said they were going to do this already, and there was a sense the government might move in this direction. So was this predictable, or is there some surprise today that the government's going to make it compulsory for care workers to have the vaccine?
Well, it shouldn't be coming as a surprise, because the consultation process actually has been run by the Department of Health and Social Care since April, and it finished on the 21st of May, I believe. And that was consulting about making mandatory requirements for care home workers to be vaccinated. So this shouldn't be unexpected for care home workers, and it shouldn't be unexpected for those running care homes.
And yet we heard a very sensible care home manager and owner just now saying there are risks here. And one of them is the legal territory. What does this mean? Is it actually make life easier for care home managers and owners if the government enshrines this in law than if they choose to do it themselves?
I think inevitably that will help. Yes, definitely. It'll help in terms of particular areas of risk, particularly around discrimination. So there are obvious risks associated with making this a mandatory requirement, because there are people who work at care homes who have particular protected characteristics like disability and or age, or one of these areas where an employer, such as a care home, might feel that they would be stepping on those areas of discrimination law without any real protection. And so with a legislation change, they would have much more of a defence. It's quite a legal, technical area, but they'd have much more justification for any indirect discrimination claims that could be brought against them as a result of mandatory vaccination. They're going to be able to justify that provision, criteria, or practice that applies. So I think, yes, it is a really good sign that the government is going to step up, legislate. I don't quite know how they're going to do that through primary legislation, which is what would be required, and step up and protect employers who need to make this very difficult decision, and obviously help to get this pandemic under control within the care home sector.
Clearly, there will have to be some exemptions. Will those need to be very carefully set out in law as well?
I think so, yeah. I mean, I think the consultation that was going on at the time that finished in May made it very clear that those medically exempt from vaccination were never going to be part of any vaccination program. So how they're going to deal with those will be easier. But there are other areas, as I said. I mean, there are so many different protected characteristics now under the Equality Act. Religion, belief, philosophical belief, disability, age, all of those factors are going to be difficult to anticipate, particularly in respect of any internal disputes that might arise. So it's difficult to see how they're going to deal with that. And then there's, of course, the area that actually the European Convention on Human Rights has an Article 8, a right to privacy, and that mandatory vaccination might be a breach of Article 8. How is the government going to deal with that, particularly in the public sector where it applies? Are they going to help care home workers and care homes deal with that potential risk? And just really the avoidance of general disputes within the workplace that can really take a lot of their time and resources away from running their businesses in already very difficult circumstances.
On the Article 8, the European Convention on Human Rights, is there some sort of get out of jail free clause here, in that you could presumably move somebody away from frontline work if they didn't want to be vaccinated, but you didn't want to terminate their employment? I mean, I don't know how many backroom jobs there are in social care, but is that the sort of way around this?
I think that's generally a way around any dispute potentially, is if you don't need to make a decision to enforce it for that particular individual, there may be other alternatives to forcing them to have that vaccine. But that might be really difficult if you run a really small care home and you've got very skilled staff and you've only got a certain amount of people that you can call upon to do that work. And of course, care homes also don't have unlimited resources, so they can't just fund people to go, on some form of unpaid leave or paid leave or furlough. Just because that individual doesn't feel they want to undertake a vaccination. So I think they've got to think carefully about how they protect against these particular risks, because individual risks result in individual tribunal claims and costs and associated risks with reputational damage and time, resources in defending those types of claims. So the government needs to legislate in a way that really covers all of those potential issues, so that both parties want to get involved in the vaccination process, which is what the government is trying to achieve here. So they need to take away some of that risk, and they need to answer some of those questions before they make this a mandatory requirement.
We were in the territory of nudge, weren't we, where people are, and we still are for most people, where people are persuaded, where a government or an organisation attempts to persuade people to behave in a certain way. And in this case, it would be persuading them to have the vaccine. And we've gone from nudge to compulsion in quite a short space of time here, haven't we?
Well, I think that's because of the pandemic and the way it's running through the workforce, and this desperation to end our restrictions and to get some normality back. I think care homes, they don't have the option of getting people to work from home. So they can't avoid the obvious scenarios that have played out where office is simply being able to work from home. There's no requirement for them to come in. Therefore, actually, they don't need to be vaccinated. Whereas with care homes, they've got little choice. So I think in this area of the industry, they've got to be a bit more bold and, they've got to look at these issues, and they've got to legislate, and they've got to probably make a mandatory requirement sooner rather than later, because they're an industry that doesn't have the alternatives available to them.
No. And do you think this is the only sector where we will see compulsory vaccination, or do you envisage it in healthcare or even other areas, other workforces too?
Yeah, and I think firstly, the consultation that was dealt with by the Department for Health and Social Care was looking at others visiting care homes. So there's all sorts of professionals that go into these care homes. So NHS workers, but all the various different professions that are involved in caring for elderly people. So they're also going to be pulled into this as well. But then there's all of these other industries completely separate to this that are also struggling to see how they can run their business safely. And there's also the health and safety risks associated with not getting a workforce vaccinated. So there's the health and safety risks associated with clients, customers, but also other staff who have been vaccinated. And there's a balancing act of hoping to protect themselves against a health and safety risk or even a personal injury risk, a personal injury claim risk, and trying to avoid that. So there isn't really, one fits all sort of scenario there. You've got to look at it individually. And I think the government in this case has got to be very clear about how they legislate for this mandatory vaccination to avoid obvious claims and disputes arising in the workplace.
Great to talk to you. Thanks for explaining it so clearly. Henry Doswell there from Doswell Law Employment Solicitors. They're based in Ashford.